She was born without sight, but her world was never truly dark. From the very first days of her life, sound became her window to everything. While other children looked at colors and shapes, she listened to the gentle music of life. The soft rustling of leaves outside her home told her when the wind changed. The footsteps of her mother in the kitchen told her when dinner was being made. The laughter of her father after a long day told her the world was safe and warm. She grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, and because everyone knew her, they also knew she was different. Some neighbors pitied her, whispering to each other that the poor blind girl would never live a normal life. They thought her path was already written, filled with struggle and silence, but she never felt broken. She simply understood the world differently. She could hear emotions in voices. She could feel moods in the way people walked past her, and she could imagine more than anyone who only relied on their eyes. Her parents loved her dearly, yet even they sometimes worried. They wondered what kind of future their daughter would have. Would she always be dependent on them, unable to do anything alone? But the little girl was not afraid of her own world. She found comfort in small details. She learned to recognize people not by their faces but by the way their voices carried. She could tell the difference between her father's tired steps and his happy steps before he even spoke a word. One evening, when she was about 5 years old, her father was repairing an old radio in the living room. She sat nearby, listening to the sound of his tools tapping and clicking against the wooden table. Suddenly the radio crackled to life, and a soft melody floated into the room. The blind girl froze. Her small head tilted as if the music itself had touched her soul. She had never heard anything so beautiful. It was not just sound, it was something alive, something speaking directly to her heart. She reached toward the radio, her fingers stretching out as if she could catch the music in her hands. Her father chuckled. "Do you like that tune?" he asked warmly. The girl nodded eagerly, her face lighting up with joy. That night she did not want to sleep. She hummed the melody again and again, trying to remember every single note. Her little voice was shaky, but her determination was strong. The next morning she found her way to the family's old piano in the corner of the room. It was dusty and out of tune, ignored for years. Her tiny fingers touched the cold keys. Pressing one carefully, the sound was sharp and strange, but her smile grew wider. She pressed another key, then another, trying to find the sound she had heard on the radio. She made mistakes, many mistakes, and the piano squeaked and groaned under her clumsy hands. But each wrong note was like a clue. Each error pushed her closer to the right sound. Day after day, she returned to the piano. Her parents thought it was just a game, something to keep her busy. But for her, it was more than a game, it was discovery. It was like learning a new language that did not need eyes. She could feel the weight of each key. She could hear the difference in their voices. And slowly, very slowly, she began to copy the melody she loved. When relatives came to visit, they would watch her tapping away at the old piano and smile politely. "She is trying," they would say in soft voices meant to sound kind but filled with pity. They believed she would never be able to play properly after all. How could a blind child learn something so complex? But the little girl ignored their whispers. She did not need to see the piano. She only needed to feel it and hear it as she grew older. The piano became her closest friend. It never judged her, never pitied her, never doubted her when she pressed its keys. It answered back with music, and in those moments, she was not a blind girl anymore. She was simply a girl who could paint pictures with sound. She imagined rivers, mountains, skies, and stars, all through the melodies she created. Though she had never seen them with her eyes, she saw them clearly in her mind in the small town. People began to notice something different. The blind girl was not like others who carried only sadness in their misfortune. She carried a spark. She walked with confidence. Guided by the rhythm of her surroundings, her head was often tilted as if she were listening to a secret that nobody else could hear. Neighbors would watch her smile to herself as she hummed new tunes, wondering what kind of world existed in her mind. And so, in a life where many thought she would be helpless, the blind girl found her gift. She could not see with her eyes, but she could see with music. The piano was not just an instrument to her. It was her sight, her light, her way of speaking to a world that had doubted her from the start. Little did anyone know, including herself, that one day this very gift would silence the whispers, break through the doubts, and astonish not just her small town, but the entire world. One afternoon, the blind girl sat in her room quietly. Her father was fixing the old radio again. It had become a habit for him, repairing wires and knobs that seemed too old to work anymore. She liked to sit beside him while he worked, listening to the strange little sounds that came from his tools. Sometimes a screw would fall and roll across the wooden floor, and she would smile, reaching to catch it before it stopped. That was her game, listening and finding. Then it happened again. The radio suddenly sparked and came alive. A melody poured out, soft and slow at first, then rising and falling like waves in the ocean. The blind girl froze in her seat. She leaned forward, her head tilted, her ears caught every note. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, as though the music was pulling her into a secret world. Her father glanced at her, surprised. He had never seen her so still, so focused. He lowered his tool and whispered, "Do you like the song?" She didn't answer with words, she just nodded, her lips trembling as though she wanted to cry but didn't know why. For the first time, she felt something she couldn't explain. It wasn't just sound, it was a voice without words, speaking directly to her heart. That night she couldn't sleep. The tune kept repeating in her mind. She lay in bed, humming softly, afraid she would forget the melody by morning. Her mother entered the room and smiled. "You're still awake," she said gently. But the little girl shook her head. "I don't want to lose the song," she whispered. Her mother kissed her forehead, not fully understanding, but touched by her daughter's determination. The next morning she found the old piano again. Its keys were dusty and cold, but to her they felt like treasure. She pressed one, then another, trying to remember the sound from the radio. The notes didn't match, they were too high, too low, sometimes sharp, sometimes soft. But she didn't stop, she pressed again and again, repeating until one note finally sounded close to the memory in her head. Her face lit up. She had found a piece of the song. Her parents watched her from the kitchen door. They thought it was sweet, almost amusing. They believed she was just playing for fun, a child keeping herself busy. They didn't realize how serious she was to them. She was a little blind girl who had limits to her. She was someone who had just discovered the key to a new world. Every day she returned to the piano. She touched the keys gently, sometimes angrily, sometimes with laughter. She made mistakes, many mistakes, but each mistake brought her closer to the melody. The neighbors would hear odd sounds drifting from the small house, broken notes, strange pauses. Sometimes they shook their heads and whispered, "Poor girl, she will never really play. She is only pretending." But she never heard those whispers, and if she did, she didn't care. Her world was filled with patience. She had no rush, she had no fear. When other children teased her because she could not run or play like them, she would simply smile and go back to her piano. For her, every wrong note was not a failure. It was a lesson. Every sound, whether good or bad, was a step closer to the truth of music. Slowly, the melody returned, piece by piece, like a puzzle only she could see with her ears. She began to play the first line without mistake, then the second. Her parents stared in shock one evening when they realized she was copying the exact tune they had heard on the radio. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. Her father stood silently, his tools resting on the table. For the first time, they saw not a blind child, but an artist in the making. As days passed, she discovered something even greater. Music was not only about repeating a song, it was about creating new feelings. She would press random keys and notice how they changed the mood. Some notes made her feel calm, others made her feel brave. She laughed when she found combinations that sounded like rain. She gasped when she discovered chords that reminded her of the stars she had never seen. She realized that the piano was more than an instrument. It was her canvas, her way of painting the invisible. Her love for music grew so strong that she began waking early just to touch the keys. She played until her fingers hurt. Sometimes she fell asleep beside the piano, her hand resting on the keys. Her parents worried at first, telling her to take breaks, but they couldn't stop her. They could see the light in her face, a light brighter than anything sight could ever give. Soon relatives came to visit. They saw her play and were shocked. "How is she doing this?" they asked. "She cannot even see the notes." But the blind girl only smiled. "I don't need to see them," she said softly. "I can hear them, I can feel them." They didn't understand. But deep down they knew they were witnessing something rare. The neighbors who once pitied her now paused outside the window. They listened quietly, some even closed their eyes, surprised at how the music touched them. The girl who could not see was suddenly making the world around her more beautiful. Her blindness no longer seemed like a weakness. It was as if it gave her a special gift, a deeper connection to sound. And so the blind girl discovered the power inside her, a gift that no one could take away. Not the whispers of neighbors, not the doubts of relatives, not even the limits of her own body. Music had become her vision, her freedom, her wings. Though she was still young and unknown to the world, the seeds of greatness had already been planted. She would play, and through her playing, she would show that sight is not the only way to see. Years passed, and the blind girl grew more skilled at the piano. Her fingers moved across the keys with confidence. Her melodies became richer, deeper, more powerful. People in her small town began to talk about her with admiration instead of pity. They would gather outside her home just to listen. Some even said she had been touched by God, that her music was not normal but a gift from heaven. One day an announcement spread through the town. A world-famous pianist was coming to the city. He was admired everywhere. Known for his fast fingers and powerful concerts, his name was spoken with respect. He was the kind of musician everyone dreamed of meeting. The blind girl, now a teenager, heard about the masterclass he was going to give. Her heart began to race. For years she had dreamed of meeting someone who lived in the world of music, someone who could understand her passion. She thought, maybe if I play for him, he will see me not as a blind girl, but as a pianist. Her parents were unsure. They feared she would be disappointed. They knew the world could be cruel, especially to someone who was different. But her determination convinced them. I have to go, she said firmly. I want to learn. I want him to hear me. So on the day of the event, they guided her to the grand hall where the master class was being held. The hall was crowded with young students, each carrying sheet music dressed neatly, waiting nervously. The famous pianist stood on stage, his presence commanding. He wore a black suit, and his hands moved gracefully whenever he touched the piano. His music filled the hall with thunder and lightning, and the crowd clapped in amazement. The blind girl sat quietly with her parents. Listening, her heart beat faster with every note. She thought, one day I want to play like that. When the time came for students to meet him, she bravely stepped forward. Her parents guided her, but she held her head high. She introduced herself softly. Sir, I am blind, but I love the piano. I would like to learn from you. For a moment there was silence. The pianist looked at her, his face unreadable, then suddenly, he let out a short laugh, not of kindness but of mockery. Blind, he said, shaking his head. How can someone who cannot even see the notes pretend to play real music? His words echoed through the hall. The other students looked at her with pity. Some even chuckled nervously. Her heart sank. She had imagined encouragement. Maybe a smile, maybe advice. Instead, she received cruelty. Her father stepped forward angrily, wanting to defend her, but she gently squeezed his hand. Stopping him, she stood there in silence, her lips pressed tightly. She did not want to cry in front of the man she had admired. Yet inside, the words cut deep. They burned in her chest. His laughter felt heavier than any darkness she had ever known. The pianist turned away, dismissing her as if she were not worth another moment. Music is for those who can read it, see it, master it, he said coldly. The hall went quiet again. His words were final. He moved on to the next student as if she had never existed. That night, she sat in her room with the piano in front of her, but she did not play. Her fingers rested on the keys, unmoving. The cruel words replayed in her mind over and over. How can someone who cannot even see the notes pretend to play real music? She whispered the sentence to herself, and each time, it felt like a blade pressing deeper into her heart. She had always known people doubted her. Neighbors, relatives, strangers, she had heard their whispers. But hearing it from someone she respected, someone she had looked up to, was unbearable. Tears slipped down her cheeks silently. She pressed her forehead against the cold piano keys. The piano that had always been her friend felt distant that night, but in the silence a small voice inside her rose. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper. I do not need eyes to see music, she told herself. I carry it in my soul. She remembered the first melody she copied from the radio. She remembered the nights she stayed awake humming until morning. She remembered the joy, the freedom, the pictures she created in her mind with sound. No cruel words could take that away. Slowly, she lifted her hands and pressed a single note. It rang in the quiet room like a ray of light. Then she pressed another and another. The tears kept falling. But the music began to flow. It was shaky at first, but soon it became stronger, more determined. She poured her pain into the keys, turning his mockery into her fuel. In that moment, she made a decision. If the famous pianist believed she was not worthy, then she would prove him wrong, not with arguments, not with anger, but with music. She would practice harder than ever. She would turn her blindness into her strength. She would show the world that she did not need sight to create beauty. Her silence tonight was not her ending. It was the pause before her greatest song. That night after the masterclass, the blind girl returned home in silence. Her parents tried to comfort her, but she kept shaking her head. She did not want to speak. Her chest was heavy, her throat was tight. She felt as though the words of the famous pianist were carved into her skin. His laughter kept echoing inside her, louder than any music she had ever heard. When she entered her room, she went straight to the piano. The old wooden keys had always been her comfort, her friend, but tonight, she only placed her hands on them without pressing a single note. Her fingers trembled, but they did not move. She bowed her head and listened to the silence. And in that silence, the cruel words replayed again. How can someone who cannot even see the notes pretend to play real music? Her heart broke. A tear slipped down her cheek and dropped onto the keys. It was the first time she cried, not because of loneliness, but because of humiliation. For years, she had dreamed of showing her music to the world. She thought a great pianist would understand her, encourage her. But instead, he had mocked her in front of everyone. She felt as though her gift meant nothing, as if all her hard work was invisible. Her father entered quietly. He wanted to tell her that the man's words did not matter. But when he saw her sitting there, her face wet with tears, he could not speak. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder. She held his hand for a moment, then gently pushed it away. She wanted to fight this battle alone. She wanted to prove something, not just to the world, but to herself. Hours passed and she remained at the piano, her fingers tracing the edges of the keys but never pressing them. She remembered the first day she touched this instrument, how her heart had danced when she copied the tune from the radio. She remembered the joy of creating sounds that felt like colors. She remembered how music had given her freedom when everyone else saw her blindness as a prison. Now, because of one man's words, that joy felt stolen. But deep inside, a small flame refused to die. She whispered to herself, I do not need eyes to see music. Music is not paper. Music is not black notes on white pages. Music is life. Music is feeling. Music is inside me. Her voice was shaky, but with every word, her courage grew stronger. Slowly, she pressed one key. The note echoed in the quiet room, soft but clear. She pressed another, then another. The sound was uneven, but it was alive. Tears kept falling, but this time she did not wipe them away. She let them flow while her fingers began to move. The music came out broken at first, filled with pain, but soon it became steady, carrying both sorrow and strength. She played not for the famous pianist, not for her parents, not even for the neighbors. She played for herself, for the little girl who once leaned close to the radio and discovered magic in a melody, for the teenager who spent nights practicing until her fingers ached, for the dreamer who believed that music was her light in the dark. The house was silent except for the sound of her piano. Her mother stood outside the door, listening. Tears filled her eyes as she heard her daughter pouring her heart into the music. Each note carried sadness, but also determination. It was the sound of a soul refusing to be broken. By the time the night ended, the blind girl was exhausted. Her fingers were sore, her face was wet with tears. Yet her heart felt different. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She realized something important. If she let his laughter destroy her, then he would win. But if she used that pain as fuel, then one day her music would silence him. Before going to bed, she touched the piano one last time and whispered, You are my eyes, you are my voice, I will not leave you. I will not give up. The piano, silent as always, seemed to glow in her imagination. She felt its warmth, its promise. She knew it would never betray her. That night she dreamed of a stage, a grand hall, and herself sitting at a shining piano. In the dream, she played with confidence, and the whole world listened in awe. She woke up with tears on her cheeks, but also a smile. For the first time since the humiliation, she felt hope again. From that day forward, she decided that her silence at the master class would not be the end of her story. It would be the pause before a powerful crescendo. The world had mocked her, but she would answer with music. Her heart was scarred, but her spirit was unbroken. From the next morning, the blind girl began a new journey. The pain of being mocked still lived in her heart, But instead of breaking her, it gave her fire. She promised herself she would never allow anyone to call her weak again. The piano, once her comfort, now became her battlefield every time she sat down. It was not only to play, it was to fight back against the cruel words that had hurt her so deeply. She practiced from dawn to night. When the sun rose, she was already at the keys, feeling her way across them. When the town slept, she was still pressing the notes, her back aching, her fingers tired. Her parents worried, telling her to rest. But she shook her head. "I must," she whispered. "I must keep going." They could see the fire in her face, and even though it hurt them to watch her push herself so hard, they knew they could not stop her at first. The sound from the piano was rough and uneven. Her fingers sometimes slipped, hitting the wrong notes, but she refused to stop. She played the same line again and again until the wrong notes disappeared. Then she moved to the next part. Her patience was endless. If she had to play a single melody 1,000 times, she would. She had nothing to prove to the famous pianist anymore. She had everything to prove to herself. Sometimes her fingers began to bleed from the effort. Her hands were small and the keys were heavy. She wrapped cloth around her fingertips and continued playing. Her mother cried when she saw the stains on the piano, but the blind girl smiled. "These are not wounds," she said softly. "They are my medals." The neighbors heard her music every day. At first it was broken, full of mistakes. They shook their heads and whispered, "She is wasting her time." But after weeks, the sound began to change. The melodies became smoother, stronger, full of emotion. People who passed by her window paused to listen. Some closed their eyes and felt the power of her playing. They could not believe that the blind girl, once pitied by all, was creating music that touched their hearts. One evening, when she played, a small crowd gathered outside her house. They did not speak, they simply listened. Some of them had once mocked her, but now their eyes filled with tears. They realized that what she created was not ordinary sound. It was the language of her soul. The blind girl herself felt different as she played. She no longer played to copy songs from the radio. She began creating her own melodies. Her fingers danced across the keys and her heart guided them. She played songs of sorrow when she remembered the cruel laughter. She played songs of hope when she thought of her dreams. She played songs of courage when she imagined herself on a stage before the whole world. There were nights when exhaustion nearly defeated her. She would rest her head on the piano and think about giving up. But then she remembered the words of the famous pianist and anger burned inside her. That anger was no longer pain. It had transformed into strength. "If he thinks I cannot play, then I will show him I can play better than anyone," she whispered to herself, and her hands returned to the keys. Her parents began to understand. They realized she was no longer just a little blind girl trying to play music. She was an artist in the making, driven by a force stronger than sight. They decided to support her fully. They found old music recordings for her to listen to. They described rhythms and patterns so she could imagine them. They encouraged her every day and slowly. Their home was no longer filled with silence and pity, but with music and hope. As months passed, the girl's skills grew beyond what anyone imagined. She could hear a song once and play it perfectly. She could invent melodies that no one had ever heard before. Her piano became her voice, her way of shouting to the world, "I am here, I am strong. I am more than blindness." People from nearby towns began to hear about her. They traveled to see her play. Some came out of curiosity, others out of doubt, but when they listened, doubt turned into amazement. The blind girl, who once seemed destined for a life of silence, was now filling hearts with sound. One evening, as she finished a long piece, she lifted her hands and smiled to herself. She could feel her soul lighter, stronger, she whispered. "I am not broken, I am not weak. Music is my sight, and with it, I will show the world who I am." From that day, she was no longer only practicing for herself. She was preparing for the moment when the world would listen. Her pain had become her power, and her weakness had become her strength. And though she could not see the road ahead, she knew exactly where it would lead, towards greatness, towards proving that even in darkness, one can create light. Months of hard work passed, and the blind girl's music only grew stronger. Her piano no longer sounded like practice, it sounded like pure magic. Each note carried her feelings, each melody told a story. People from different places came to listen, and some even said she had a gift that was impossible to ignore. One day news reached her town. A big music competition was going to be held in the city. The best students and musicians would perform, and the winner would be given a scholarship and a chance to perform on bigger stages. The blind girl's heart raced when she heard the news. She knew this was her chance, not just to play but to prove herself. Her parents were nervous. They worried she would face humiliation again. But she was calm. "I am not afraid," she told them. "This is my moment." After all the nights of pain, practice and persistence, she felt ready. She wanted the world to hear her, not with pity but with respect. When the day of the competition arrived, the hall was grand and full of people. The air was thick with excitement. Contestants sat nervously, holding their sheet music, whispering to each other about who might win. The blind girl sat quietly with her parents. She had no sheet music to hold. She had no eyes to see the hall, but she could feel the energy. The murmurs, the anticipation. Her heart beat quickly, but she kept reminding herself of the promise she had made, to never give up, to let the piano be her eyes. When she stepped onto the stage, the crowd went silent. Whispers began to spread. "She is blind," someone said. "How can she play without seeing?" others murmured. Some doubted her, some felt pity, but no one expected what was about to happen. As she adjusted herself on the piano bench, her hands trembling slightly, she heard footsteps near the judges' table. Her heart skipped a beat. One of the judges was the same man, the famous pianist who had mocked her months ago. She recognized his voice instantly when he greeted the audience. It was sharp, confident, and unforgettable. She froze for a moment, remembering his cruel laughter, remembering his words for a second. Doubt tried to crawl back into her heart. Her chest tightened. She could almost hear him saying again, "How can someone who cannot even see the notes pretend to play real music?" But then, she straightened her back. She pressed her palms against her lap and whispered to herself, "This is not his stage, this is mine." The lights dimmed. The audience leaned forward, waiting. She placed her fingers on the keys. The hall was silent. So silent she could hear her own heartbeat. She closed her eyes, not because she needed to, but because this was how she saw best in her own world of sound and imagination. The first note rang out soft and delicate. It was followed by another, then another. Her hands began to move gracefully. She played a melody she had created herself, filled with sorrow and hope. Her fingers danced across the piano with confidence. The music rose and fell like waves, carrying the audience into her world. People who had doubted her forgot their doubts. They closed their eyes, listening. Some felt their throats tighten. Others felt tears in their eyes. The blind girl was not just pressing keys. She was speaking to their souls. She was telling them a story without words. The famous pianist who had once mocked her leaned forward. His expression shifted. His eyes widened as he listened. He could not believe what he was hearing. The girl he had dismissed so easily was now filling the hall with a performance that even he could not ignore. As the music built higher, the audience leaned closer. Her hands moved faster, yet every note was perfect, full of emotion. The hall was filled with something powerful, something bigger than music. It was courage. It was pain turned into beauty. When she reached the final note, she let it linger in the air, soft but shining. Then silence followed for a moment. The entire hall was frozen. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as though time itself had stopped. Then suddenly the silence broke into thunderous applause. The audience stood to their feet, clapping, cheering. Some shouted her name, some cried openly. The sound of their love and respect washed over her like a wave. She smiled, her heart soaring. She could not see the crowd, but she could feel their energy, their acceptance. She rose from the piano bench and bowed her head gently. Her parents in the front row cried and clapped harder than anyone. They knew their daughter had not just played a song. She had written her destiny. The famous pianist stood slowly, his face pale. He did not clap at first, but then his hands joined the applause. His pride was broken, replaced by awe. He knew at that moment that he had been wrong. The blind girl did not need sight to see music. She had shown that music was not something written on paper. It was something born in the soul. That night, she left the stage not as a blind girl mocked by the world, but as a musician who had stunned them into silence. She had faced her greatest fear, and she had won. The moment of truth had arrived, and she had turned it into her greatest triumph. The first note she played in that hall was soft, almost like a whisper. Then it grew stronger, carrying her feelings out into the air. The blind girl had closed her eyes, but not because she needed to for her. The music was not on the keys, it was inside her heart. She played as if the piano itself was breathing. Her fingers moved lightly, then faster, then slower. Each touch told a story. The audience leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her hands. But soon many of them closed their eyes, not out of pity, but because the music was so powerful that they didn't need to see. They wanted to feel it the way she did, with the heart, not with the eyes. Her melody rose like the sun and fell like the rain. It carried sadness, but also hope. It carried pain, but also strength. The people listening forgot where they were. They forgot that she was blind. They forgot that they had doubted her. All that remained was the sound of her soul, pouring into every note. Some in the audience began to cry quietly. The music touched memories they had long buried. A mother thought of her child. A man remembered his lost love. A young student felt courage for the first time. The blind girl's music was not just music. It was a mirror, showing each listener their own feelings. The famous pianist who once mocked her sat frozen. His eyes were locked on her hands at first. His pride wanted to deny her talent, but the sound was undeniable. He had spent his whole life mastering speed, power, and perfection, yet in this moment, he realized he had never played like her. He had never poured his soul into the keys the way she did. The blind girl's hands moved faster now. The melody grew louder, filling every corner of the hall. The audience felt their hearts racing. They could not look away. Her music had no sheet, no rules. It was pure emotion turned into sound, and then, just as the energy reached its highest point, she slowed down, letting the last notes fall like drops of rain. The hall was silent, completely silent for a moment. It felt as though time had stopped. Everyone sat in awe, afraid even to breathe. Then one by one, people began to rise. Their hands clapped together, slowly at first, then faster, louder, until the applause became thunder. The sound echoed through the hall, but even louder than the clapping were the cries. "Bravo, bravo," voices shouted. "Amazing! Incredible." The blind girl sat still, her hands resting gently on the piano. She could not see the standing ovation, but she could hear it. She could feel the vibration of their clapping through the floor. She could sense the love and respect in the air. A smile spread across her face, a smile filled with relief, pride, and gratitude. For her, the real victory was not the applause. It was the silence she had created just moments before. In that silence, before the clapping began, she knew she had reached their hearts. She had spoken a language beyond sight and words. And they had understood. The famous pianist finally stood. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He clapped slowly, his pride broken. He realized now that he had been wrong. He had once told her she could never play real music. But she had just proven that real music was not something you read with your eyes. It was something you felt with your soul. And she had more soul than anyone he had ever met. The audience did not stop clapping. Some people whistled, some wiped their tears. Some shouted her name even though they had only just learned it. Parents hugged their children. Couples held hands. Strangers looked at each other with wet eyes, united by what they had just witnessed. The blind girl had given them more than a performance. She had given them a piece of her heart. She stood slowly from the piano bench and bowed. Her parents in the front row cried with pride. Her mother's face was wet with tears. Her father's hands shook as he clapped. They had always believed in her, but even they were stunned by the power of her music. They saw not their little blind daughter anymore, but a young woman who had turned pain into greatness. The moment was unforgettable. People would speak of it for years, they would say. "Do you remember the blind girl who played that night? Do you remember how she made the whole hall cry?" Her performance became a story carried from mouth to mouth. A story of courage, talent, and the strength of the human spirit. As the applause continued, the blind girl whispered to herself, "This is who I am, this is my gift, my blindness is not my cage. It is my freedom." She touched the piano once more, as if thanking it for standing with her through every tear, every night of practice, every moment of doubt. The famous pianist lowered his head, ashamed of the cruelty he had once shown, but also grateful. For in her music, he too had learned something. He realized that technical skill was nothing without heart, and that true greatness came from honesty. Courage and pain turned into beauty. And so, in that hall, the blind girl gave more than a performance. She gave proof to the world, proof that vision does not come from the eyes but from the soul. And every person who left the hall that night carried her music with them, a melody that would live forever in their hearts. When the last note of her performance faded into the air, the world seemed to pause. The audience stood, clapping and cheering. Their voices filled the hall, but inside her heart, she felt a different kind of silence. It was the silence of peace, the silence of victory. For years she had carried the weight of doubt, pity, and cruel words, and now all of it had been washed away by her music. The famous pianist who had once mocked her walked slowly toward the stage. His footsteps echoed in the hall. Everyone watched, wondering what he would do. He had laughed at her before. He had dismissed her. But now his face was no longer proud, no longer filled with arrogance. His eyes were soft, and his hands trembled as he reached out to her. "Forgive me," he whispered, loud enough for the hall to hear. "I was wrong. I thought music belonged only to those who could see. But tonight you showed me that true music belongs to the soul. You do not need sight. You are sight itself for the world." His voice cracked with emotion. The audience gasped, then clapped even louder, cheering for her, cheering for the truth that had finally been spoken. The blind girl bowed her head. She did not speak much, she simply smiled. Her heart did not need revenge. It did not need anger. It only needed the music. And she knew she had already won, not against the famous pianist, but against every doubt she had ever faced. From that night on, her life changed. Newspapers wrote about her. Journalists called her the girl who plays with her soul. Videos of her performance spread, and soon the whole world knew her name. Invitations came from places she had never heard of. Cities far away wanted her to perform. People wanted to meet the blind girl whose music could make even strangers cry. When she walked onto new stages, the audiences no longer saw her blindness first. They saw her strength, they saw her courage. They listened with respect, not pity, each time she played. People closed their eyes and felt the music as if they too were blind. They realized they did not need to see the keys to understand. They only needed to feel just like her. Her parents traveled with her, always sitting in the front row, proud beyond words. They remembered the little girl who once leaned close to the radio, trying to copy a simple melody. They remembered the nights she stayed awake, practicing until her hands ached. Now they watched her play in great halls, moving people from every corner of the world. Their daughter had not only found her gift, she had become a symbol of hope. Children who felt broken heard her story and believed they could rise. People who carried shame found courage. Families who lost hope found strength. She did not just play music, she gave people faith in themselves. Her blindness was no longer seen as a weakness. It was her power. It made her different. It made her strong. The famous pianist who once mocked her never forgot that night. He often told his students about her, admitting his mistake. "Do not play with your eyes," he would tell them. "Play with your soul," like the blind girl did. And even though he had once laughed at her, he now carried her lesson with humility. As the years passed, her legacy grew, but she remained humble. She never thought of herself as famous. To her, she was still the little girl sitting at the old dusty piano, pressing wrong keys until the right ones appeared. She often said, "Music saved me, music gave me sight. And if my music can save even one other soul, then my journey is worth it." Audiences across the world agreed. Whenever she played, the halls were filled, not only with sound but with silence, the kind of silence where people held their breath, not wanting to miss even a single note. Her music reminded them of the power of faith, patience, and courage. Her story became more than just a tale of a blind girl who played the piano. It became a lesson whispered from one generation to another, a story told in classrooms and families and conversations between strangers. People said, if she could rise, if she could shine without sight, then what excuse do we have? And so, the blind girl once mocked and doubted became a beacon of inspiration. Her blindness never defined her limits, it defined her strength. She showed the world that greatness does not come from what you see with your eyes, but what you feel with your soul. Even when she sat alone with her piano, away from the lights and the applause, she would press the keys and smile, for she knew the truth. She had never played for fame. She had never played for revenge. She had always played for love, for the love of music, for the love of life, and in that love, she found freedom. Her story ended not in silence, but in a melody that lived on. Each note she left behind continued to echo in the hearts of those who heard her. A blind girl who once faced laughter and pity had stunned the entire world, not with her eyes but with her soul. And that was her legacy, an eternal song of courage, hope, and inspiration.